People who have gone out for a pack of cigarettes and never went back to your family. What happened after you left? Story 1. Got married right out of high school. Everything was going well, but we were young and both were our first partners. I came home early one day and walked in on my wife with another man. Standard insanity ensued, followed by her begging for forgiveness, and we went to months of counseling. Everything seemed well and dandy. She seemed like a totally different woman and couldn't live without me. One day, I logged into our desktop PC and her Facebook is loaded and there are multiple messages, and I had to look. I found exactly what I knew I would find. It crushed me, but I acted like nothing happened. That weekend, I packed up my favorite clothes and belongings that meant a lot to me and snuck them to the car. Sunday evening, I said, "Hey, I'm going to take the dogs to the dog park and hike for a few hours." When I left, I texted our neighbor to see if anyone showed up at the house. She replied pretty quickly that a male visitor was by very quickly. I told her goodbye and I just drove. I had a decent savings and thought get start off somewhere new, and that is what I did. My ex-wife didn't even try and contact me until around lunchtime the next day. When I didn't respond, she blew me up with photos and videos of her with multiple men and about how bad of a lover I was. It hit me up, but I just kept trucking. I ended up in a smaller town where I saw someone was hiring for my trade. Years later, I remarried to the best human ever. I went home not long ago and my mom posted a picture of us at a gathering. My ex hit up my Facebook and asked if we could meet for a cup of coffee. She would like some closure. I obviously would like as well. I have to say, for all the resentment and hatred I had towards this woman, our conversation was still pleasant and I felt better after we talked. She understood why I left. She apologized deeply many times and didn't try to blame me for anything. After an hour and a little bit of tears, awkward as hell in public, she asked if it was okay to get a hug. We hugged and said our goodbyes. Once I got home, I told my wife about the visit and she got awkward for a few minutes. She left the room and I didn't follow. I thought, oh, I'm sleeping on the couch tonight. 5 minutes later, she came back crying and just gave me the biggest hug ever. She told me she forgot what I went through and she was sorry and glad our life is good. Closing. I left a terrible human for the best human ever. Story 2. I didn't go out for cigarettes, but I pulled a similar stunt. My mom is abusive and I had no spine, so I told her I was going to move in with my dad for the summer. I said I would be back before the end of August. After I moved in with my dad, I got my state ID. My mom didn't want me to have any kind of ID and I finally got my driver's permit a few weeks later. I felt bad for lying at the time, but now I know if I didn't lie to her, I would have never gotten out of there. I would be stuck living on a little hobby farm with a woman who did everything in her power to tear me down and hurt me. When I was 18, I moved out from my abusive father. I was commuting to college at the time and I had morning classes. So the night before, I packed my car with as much of my stuff as I could and set off. One of my professors that I regularly talked to after class noticed that my car was full of clothes and asked if everything was okay. Over lunch, I explained my situation and he offered to take me in. I had already made arrangements to live with my mother after my classes for the day were over. I went home for the first time since I was a child to live with my mother. I slept on the couch for months before getting my own bed, and we didn't always have the money to eat, but we made it work. I have seen my father one time since then because he swore to me that he had changed. That night he proceeded to get wasted and tried to put his hands on me. I haven't seen him since and I have no regrets. I was 10 years old when my mom and dad split up. We had been expecting it, but I didn't know that my mom had packed up suitcases for herself, my sister, and I. One day we went to school like everything was normal and went to my mom's parents after school. It wasn't unusual for us to have dinner there, but then my mom sat us down and told us we'd be staying there for a while. Ended up being 6 years before we got our own place. I never got to go back to my bedroom again. My dad got remarried and his wife's daughter moved in and repainted my room. When I had to visit them, I slept on the couch while she slept in my room. When I was 16, I moved out without telling my stepdad, but my mom was in on it and I just moved in with my grandparents. I left on a Friday. Got all my stuff in just 2 trips. I was told he didn't even notice. I was gone the first weekend. He was pretty mad once he figured it out, but it was all mostly a non-event. Everything turned out okay for me. It had been 21 years this September. My dad died when I was pretty young. My mom eventually remarried to a pretty cool guy when I was young. He was honestly an amazing dad, and my mom got sick when I was 12. He was absolutely incredible, taking care of everyone and reaffirming that I was a son. When my mom died, it was just me and him for a few years, and there were some amazing times. He made sure I was seeing a counselor and we did family things on the weekend. My friends used to joke that he wasn't even my biological dad, and he still made more time for me and did more things for me than their biological dads did. When I was 15, he got remarried. I didn't exactly like my new stepmom, but I didn't hate her. I think I just thought the relationship wouldn't last and he'd move on to someone better. Then they got married and it was kind of weird. I did get an amazing baby brother from that. Not bad at all. My dad died when I was 17, literally taken out by an undiagnosed severe allergy. My stepmom got me from school and drove me to the hospital, and when my dad passed away, she handed me my baby brother and said she needed a minute by herself. I never saw her again. She was much younger than my dad and was an ex-foster kid with no family or best friends to support her, and I think she looked at her newborn baby and the kid her dead husband inherited and just couldn't handle it. I sure know I wasn't prepared to handle it. But my mom and my biological dad had been ex-foster care kids, and mom told me a few stories, so I wasn't going to let that happen to me or my brother. I do sometimes feel a little resentful that I can't have the normal life. I'm working too much and I have a 6-year-old to figure out to consider college. But I don't want my family to just be cycles of poverty and dead-end jobs. Growing up, my mother was pretty abusive, mostly emotional to me and my little sister. This includes basically fabricating a false reality that my dad had divorced my mother and left her penniless, then left the state, as well as isolating us from other family members on the basis that they were bad people. Probably the worst thing she did, which I still deal with today, was turning me and my little sister against each other in these ducked-up scenarios. Basically, her drug and her alcohol-induced rage of the day would always fall on one of us. However, whoever told on the other sibling that they did something to anger my mother would face her wrath, and the other sibling would have a brief respite. This went on since I was 8 or so. I grew up hating my sister. After I got older, I found my best friend in high school, and he helped me understand just how ducked up my situation was, given that I assumed that's how family life was, since we were so isolated. No TV or internet, and that my mother was also a teacher at both my elementary and middle school. She had control over everything. At 18, I left my house and moved in with my friend. However, it wasn't forever. He was joining the army at the end of school, and I had to think of someone to stay with. So I found my dad states away. I took a long shot and asked him if I could stay with him. He accepted. I got everything I owned in the world, which fit in a truck bed, and while most kids were going off to college, I was going to start over in a completely different place with a father I didn't know. It turned out my dad was a decent guy. He wasn't a saint by any means, but leagues better than my mother. He helped me get a driver's license and eventually helped me join the military, where I have just finished my first year in. I haven't seen my little sister in 2 years though, and she still hates me even though she's 18. She hasn't left her mother, and since I left she's become closer with her. I regret not trying harder to be there for her every day. But as for my life, now I have 3 years left in the military. Then I hope to go to college and become a pilot, none of which I ever thought of when I was living under my mother's roof. Story 3.
My ex-husband was extremely physically and emotionally abusive, as well as an alcoholic addict. He obsessively controlled the money in every second of my daily routine. An unplanned 5-minute delay to get gas on the way home would result in a dressing down, if I was lucky. A beating, if I wasn't. We had 3 daughters, and on the few occasions I threatened to leave, he'd tell me to go ahead and leave, but I couldn't take our daughters with me. At one of our couple's friends' wedding reception, he got drunk as per usual and lost his mind over something insignificant. Dragged me around in the street by my hair and pulled a gun on me in front of the wedding party. One of his friends, who was a real boss, took me aside while the groom's mom was driving my ex home and told me, "You don't have to live like this." It was like a light went on in my head. This guy says I don't have to live like this. It took me a couple of weeks to put a plan in place. But one morning after my ex left for work, my dad helped me pack everything that would fit in a U-Haul, and I got the duck out. I'd like to say I never saw him again after that day, but I was pretty lucky. He decided to leave me alone after an initial period of stalking and about in jail for violating an order of protection. Fast forward 15 years and I finished undergrad law school and postdoc. I remarried with 2 more amazing kids, and life is pretty much my goal. My mom just all of a sudden wasn't there anymore. She and my dad were miserable, but my dad wouldn't agree to divorce. He was a minister at a big church and didn't believe divorce was right, and so instead he tried to stay married to my mom, all while avoiding her and all the unhappiness at home. She never really left her bedroom. She was miserable, and she made everyone else miserable too. She was horrible to me in those last few years. We had been really close before that. She started moving stuff out of the house little by little when no one was home. Like one day a bookshelf would be gone and we'd all notice, but just kind of go on with our lives, and it bothers me very, very much. But her moving out was so abrupt and so ambiguous that I don't remember specifics about it. Like I don't know if it was during the school year or over summer. I don't know where I was or what was different when I came home that day, but at some point she didn't live there anymore. I was 14. My dad told me that God told him she would never come back. I looked up to my dad a lot. He was kind of on the same level as God in my mind, so I believed him. He soon started dating another woman secretly because the church didn't know he was divorced yet. He intended to marry her as soon as possible. I remember I had to pose for family photos with this new woman and her 2 kids. They were printed up and put into a frame and hung over our fireplace. Then one day my mom came to the house. She told me she had made the biggest mistake of her life, that she loved me and my brother, my dad, and she wanted to work everything out. I guess God was wrong when he spoke to my dad. Then she walked out of my room and saw the new family portrait over the fireplace. She left quickly. A few days later she called the house. My dad answered and she told him to tell the kids I said goodbye. Then she hung up. We started calling everyone we could think to call. We tried to call the phone operator asking if they could trace the call. This was 1995, so no caller ID or cell phone with a callback number. A bit later that night, my new stepmom-to-be came over and pulled my dad aside. She saw a car at the end of our neighborhood that looked like my mom's. My dad called 911. Everyone showed up. My mom had taken a bucket of pills. She was barely alive. They took her to the ER and pumped her stomach and intubated her. They told my dad to call my brother so he could come say his goodbyes too. I was led into the room for a while. I looked at the machines and they were plugged into the wall, and I stared for a long time thinking I should unplug it because she really didn't want to be revived. And I couldn't understand why we were doing all this. But then a nurse came in and said I had to leave while they did stuff. My mom survived. My dad married the other lady. I think this messed me up, and I honestly can't believe I typed up this entire recollection. I don't think about it very often, and maybe that's why I can't remember the details of the day. I realized she'd moved out.